Thank you all for joining us tonight for the book launch for Mariola V. Alvarez's The Affinity of Neoconcretism and Adele Nelson's Forming Abstraction. I'm Nicole Kack. I'm editorial program manager here at ISLAA, and it's wonderful to see so many familiar faces out in the audience tonight. For those of you who are not familiar with ISLAA, we were founded in 2011, and we support the study and visibility of Latin American art. ISLAA recognizes Latin American artists and cultural movements as integral to the trajectory of 20th and 21st century art. We seek to expand these narratives by creating opportunities for researchers, curators, and the public through grants, exhibitions, publications, and our art and archival collections. ISLAA's partnerships with educational and art institutions include New York University, Columbia University, CCS Bard, the New Museum, Dia Art Foundation, and University of California Press. So it's been my pleasure to, in my time at ISLAA, work with Professor Albero, as well as our colleagues at the University of California Press on the Studies on Latin American Art series, of which these two titles are a part. So it's wonderful to be able to celebrate them tonight with all of you through this dialogue. I want to thank our panelists, Roberto Conduru, who will be moderating tonight, as well as our authors, Adele Nelson and Mariola Alvarez, as well as colleagues who are in the room, Lucy Hunter, who's our executive director here in the back, my colleague, Rebecca Rio, who welcomed you into the space, and finally, our founder, Ariel Isaacs. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over the microphone to Alexander Albero.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, hello everybody. I'm very happy to be here. First, let me congratulate Adele Nelson and Mariola Alvarez on publishing their excellent studies with the studies on Latin American art and Latin American and Latinx series that my colleague Jennifer Gonzalez and I edit with the University of California Press. Both of these volumes contribute significantly to the history of Latin American art and ground mid-20th century Brazilian art in particular in some of the most important art historical debates of their time. Second, I want to thank the wonderful acquisitions editors that we work with at the University of California Press, and want to thank them for the continued support for our series and for making these publications a reality. I really couldn't ask for a better team to work with than the group that I've encountered in Oakland with the press. And third, I want to give an important shout out to Ariel Isaacs and ISLAA's founder, who has long promoted the understanding of Latin American culture through the fine arts, and also to his team here in New York, many of whom are in this room. Since its formation in 2011, ISLAA's support of artists and curators and scholars through its underwriting of public lectures and distinguished grants, art exhibitions, conferences, and publications related to Latin American art has enabled many interesting projects to take place. The studies on Latin American Latinx art series that Adele Nelson and Mariola Alvarez's books are part of is a testament to ISLAA's commitment to scholarship. The books in the Studies of Latin American and Latinx series encompass studies of art history and cultural practices emerging from Central and South America, the Caribbean, the US, and the Latin American diaspora more generally in the 20th and 21st centuries. International and cosmopolitan in scope, this series seeks to address the production, exhibition, and dissemination of art in and between countries and continents. Also to present and analyze innovative research concerning intellectual content making in the Americas, and to broaden the public for exciting new scholarship on the area. It features titles in English, and we've also translated a couple of titles of exceptional studies by Latin American and Latinx scholars. Topics we have published to date include art, exhibition, and social history, investigations on the relation between the art and social context of specific nations, comparative analyses of different cultural traditions and milieus, in-depth monographic examinations of important artists or artistic collectives, and interdisciplinary works that bridge the fields of art history, media studies, architecture, anthropology, literature, film, and cultural criticism. Last week, we celebrated the publication of Andrea Giunta's The Political Body, Stories on Art, Feminism, and Emancipation. And later this month, we will convene here again to celebrate the most recent publication in the series, Sean Netzerol Moncada's Refined Material, Petroculture, and Modernity in Venezuela. The recent expansion of the series to include Latinx art follows logically from its initial focus by highlighting the interest in Latinx art in the series' title. Jennifer Gonzalez and I aim to be even more attentive to art historical studies that address cultural identity and hybridity, and that bring the proliferation of scholarship on Latinx art into a greater dialogue with Latin American art history. The broadening of the series will give greater prominence to art produced by this growing demographic, revealing similarities and differences between different constituencies of Latin American culture, and expanding the art historical canon in productive ways. As our webpage at the University of California Press indicates, our series now solicits manuscripts that approach modern and contemporary Latin American and Latinx art from various interdisciplinary methodologies and perspectives. To get the evening started, let me introduce Professor Roberto Conduru, who will moderate the panel between Adele Nelson and Mariola Alvarez. Professor Conduru is Endowed Distinguished Professor of Art History at Southern Methodist University in University Park, Texas. His publications include Ax Bahia, The Power of Art in an Afro-Brazilian Metropolis from 2017, Arquitecture Aguda ao Benin e ao Togo from 2016, Perolas Negras, Primeiros Fios from 2013, Arte Afro-Brasileira of 2007. Professor Conduru has also written a handful of monographs and contributed essays to journals including Third Text Africa, Arte and Ensayos, Art and Translation, Critical Interventions, and others. Added to this, he has also curated and co-curated a number of important exhibitions, including most recently Martino Patricio Recorte at the SESC Pompeia in Sao Paulo this year. Please help me in welcoming Roberto Conduru.
Good evening, everyone. Boa noite. Thanks for the kind introduction, Professor Alberto, and for the opportunity to participate in the launching of this two brave women's book. First, I congratulate you, Professor, on the collection Studies on Latin American Art. With its 8 edited titles, it's making a decisive transformation in Latin American art history. After the publication of exhibition catalogs from the 1990s, academic books in English have been constituting a new historiography of Latin America's visual culture and art in the last decades. However, we have something different in this case, a collection exclusively dedicated to Latin American art and comprising single author books focused on varied themes in modern and contemporary art, many of which emphasize transdisciplinary subjects. The design of the books expressed display of unity and difference. At the same time, it characterizes the collection and individualizes each volume with exclusive detail. Not to mention the dream of many authors and readers. Lots of images, many of them colored images. Most importantly, the collection helps to delineate Latin America as an open, multi-connected geopolitical region. Even books with broader scopes, such as Nico Vicarius and Andrea Giunta's volumes, do not aim to encompass Latin America as a fixed, homogeneous, and immutable totality. Some books help to build the field with partial approaches. I'm thinking about Maria Amalia Garcia's analysis of abstractionism in cultural exchange between Argentina and Brazil, Cara Cabanhas connecting Brazil, Venezuela, and Western Europe to discuss meaning and materiality from mid-20th century to now, and Karen Benesra discussing art and design in Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. There are also books focused on one nation without nationalistic or totalizing approach, like the one you mentioned by Sean Moncada's study on art and architecture in Venezuela. Two recent volumes detach Brazil, the ones we are here today to launch, discuss, and celebrate. One of them is Forming Abstraction, Art and Institutions in Post-War Brazil, the 2023 Antônio Cândido Prize recipient for the Best Humanities Book from Brazil section of the Latin American Studies Association. It was written by Dr. Adele Nelson, who is an associate professor of art history at the University of Texas at Austin, where she also serves as associate director of the Center for Latin American Visual Cultures. Her writings have appeared in Art Journal, Arlogi, Art Margins, Modus, and museum publications. Her research has received support from the American Philosophical Society, the Fulbright U.S. Scholar Program, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Most recently, she co-edited the forthcoming exhibition catalog, Social Fabric, Art and Activism in Contemporary Brazil, which received the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts Grant. The other book being launched today is The Affinity of Neoconcretism, Interdisciplinary Collaborations in Brazilian Modernism, 1954-1964, written by Dr. Mariola V. Alvarez, who received her PhD in art history from the University of California, San Diego, and is an assistant professor of art history at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture at Temple University, and is a historian of Latin American art of the 20th and 21st centuries, specializing in the history of abstraction in Brazil. Results of her research have been published in journals like Third Text in Art and exhibition catalogs on Maria Martins and art of the Asian diaspora in Latin America. She co-edited the book New Geographies of Abstract Art in Post-War Latin America, expanding the current research by leading scholars in the field, and received the Fulbright U.S. Scholar Award to conduct research in Brazil towards her second book project, where we examine the art of the Japanese diaspora in the country. The two books depart from turning points and landmarks in the history of Brazil's visual arts, which have assumed monumental dimensions in its historiography. Abstractionism and concretism, the creation of art museums in post-war, and the São Paulo Biennial in Adele Nelson's book, Neoconcretismo in Mariola Alvarez's book. Some of these movements and institutions have become totem taboos in Brazil, being more worshipped and almost untouched by critics and art historians. I have long waited for a new book on Neoconcretismo, a crucial movement in Brazil's visual art that scholars have not been critically studying as it deserves. The same goes for the early experiments in abstract and concrete art in the São Paulo Biennial, the first ones, which are very acclaimed, but not studied. They were always seen as only preliminary experiments to further artistic achievements. With thoughtful and thorough research, dense reflections on a great amount of great sources, Adele and Mariola quickly rediscuss these topics and go beyond, as we can notice from the book's titles to their structures, in analysis of works, text, and events. In Adele's volume, it's essential to note the book title with its verb in the gerund, forming, indicating her analysis of artistic and social-cultural process. The subtitle, Art and Institutions in Postwar Brazil, advances her chapters alternating between detaching art, institutions, and artistic ideas, experiments, and achievements from the late 40s to mid-1950s, focusing on the creation and activities of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro Museums of Modern Art, the first two editions of the São Paulo Biennial, and the groups Ruptura and Frente. Although many authors frequently mention these art movements and institutions, they were not analyzed in depth as Adele does, showing how creative, theoretical, and institutional realms intertwined in one of Brazil's most intense moments of artistic theorization, debate, and creation. In Mariola's book, I highlight the noun and the adjective in the subtitle, Interdisciplinary Collaborations, which signals her analysis of neoconcretism as a movement resulting from interactions between artists working in different fields. In parallel, sometimes connected process, they abandon certain principles and elements of traditional arts, reconfiguring them in dialogues with other arts, which were also under renewing process, creating works that challenge old terminologies. Thus, in each chapter, she focused on a field, poetry, design, dance, and architecture, with which neoconcrete artists experimented, departing from painting, sculpture, engraving, or drawing, towards the creation of new art forms that requested new theories and concepts. Since both Adele and Mariola expanded their analysis to better understand art and its context, these books cover the period between the Second World War and the beginning of the Brazilian military-civilian dictatorship in 1964. It was certainly one of the most exciting periods in Brazilian art and culture, a moment of openings and promises, challenges and achievements, although full of contradictions, unfortunately, many of which remain unresolved. But I'm talking too much. I think it's time to let the authors present their books and explain to us this period, its art, from their books. Thank you very much.
First of all, you weren't talking too much. My book came out during the pandemic, so to hear somebody speak in public about my book is like mind-blowing to me. So thank you a lot, and thank you all at ISLAA for doing this. For Mariola and I, it's a real honor to get to be in person rather than online and with beloved people. The thank yous I'm going to start with don't even scratch the surface of the debts I owe for this book. Many of the people in this room I owe tremendous amounts of love and gratitude to, but let me thank Ariel as well as Blanca and Lucy and Nicole and their colleagues here at ISLAA. Thank Alex as well, not just for including my book in the series that you now co-edit, but also for all the mentorship you extended to me early on in my career and the early speaking opportunities. I'm very grateful. And I'm honored to be sharing this event with my friend Mariola and one of the many tremendous Brazilian scholars who so generously welcomed us gringas into your field. And we're in a room and with mics and all this stuff, and the idea is conversation. So I'm gonna, as I was asked to, share some things about my book, but I'm gonna try to keep it brief. So, okay. Oh, that's nice of you. Thank you, Nicole, for making me a title slide. As my book came out in February of 2022, I'm gonna frame it via my and others' more current thinking. So this includes for me my co-organization of the exhibition Social Fabric, Art and Activism in Contemporary Brazil, and its soon to be released publication with University of Texas Press, which is what I'm showing you the cover of here. which presented 67 works by 10 mid-career and emerging artists at the Visual Arts Center at UT this last year from September 2022 to March 2023. And it was via the early research and planning for this exhibition, which overlapped with the final work that I was doing on the Forming Abstraction book, that I had the privilege of studying and meeting Rosana Paulino's production and meeting her in Austin before the pandemic in February of 2020, when, in collaboration with my colleagues in Latin American Studies, we brought her to Austin to give an artist talk as well as a keynote address in a conference at the Latin American Studies Center. She also spoke with my students, my graduate students, during the pandemic virtually. And decades into my fascination with concretism and neoconcretism, dating back to my study abroad at PUC-Rio in the late 1990s, Paulino's mixed media series, Brazilian-style geometry, arrived to tropical paradise, quite literally blew my mind, in their forceful equation of geometric abstraction with scientific racism, extractivism, and colonialism writ large. The compositions of Paulino's hybrid prints and collage works juxtapose colorful, flat rectangles and bands that recall the vibrant palette of seminal works of Brazilian post-war abstraction, including Ligia Papi's Book of Creation. The artist overlaps these collage-colored blocks with digital prints from a variety of 19th century sources, ranging from black and white photographs and illustrations of Black and Indigenous people to botanical and crayometric studies, some rendered as reversed images and taking the effect of X-ray. This group of Paulino's work and her larger production ask us what politics informed the production and reception of abstract art at mid-century and today, and whose interests were and are served by these artist proposals. So her work gave me a whole new set of questions that I brought to as I was wrapping up my book and that I'm continuing to think through. So in the decade following World War II, abstract artists that's the image I meant to be on. Abstract artists in Brazil's cosmopolitan cities of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo were celebrated, literally on the front page of the newspaper and in detailed interviews and columns, as nonconformists who modeled engaged civic participation as new citizens for a democratic Brazil. Emergent middle-class men like Geraldo de Barros and affluent white women like Ligia Clark were touted as public thinkers, and their works were seen as innovations. In my book, I chronologically begin in the 40s and some of the even earlier discussions in the 30s of the Modern Art Museum for São Paulo in the context of an earlier dictatorship than the one Roberto alluded to, the Estado Novo dictatorship, and conclude in the mid-50s. And this pairing that you guys have envisioned for tonight makes sense because both of our books are on Brazil, but my book also ends where Mariola's begins, which is the National Exhibition of Concrete Art in 56 and 57. I include in-depth studies of works and exhibitions from the late 40s into the mid-50s. I'm just showing you two figures that are through lines in my book and other works by Geraldo de Barros and Ligia Clark from the early and mid-50s. I propose revised dating of works in some cases and recover original titles and exhibition context in order, I hope, to provide new insights into the ideas, chronologies, and geographies of abstract practices and theories. Namely, I assert that a nexus of artists and theorists between Rio and São Paulo developed a discourse oriented by the notion of forma, or form, for early Brazilian concretism in the late 40s and beginning in the 30s. This was prior to, this is not gonna work with the tech setup we have here. This is a newsreel. There are some fun images of Max Bill's sculpture, which if you want to see them, we can figure out the technology later. But this intellectual dialogue between critics and artists between Rio and São Paulo about forma and the titling of works, forma objetos, happens prior to Max Bill's inclusion in the first Biennale in late 1951 and coincided with his solo exhibition at MASP. In making this assertion, I join with other art historians to resist the facile centering of a Swiss artist as the progenitor of Brazilian abstraction and the persistent characterization of Carioca and Paulista artists as opposites. Another objective of my book is to argue, oh, it did work. Oh, darn it. Sorry, well, I'll let this go then, because it's pretty bananas. So it's a newsreel. It's like from the Cinemateca Brasileira, which many of you know had a very catastrophic fire, but they had digitized under Bolsonaro because of neglect and firing of their staff. So this is Darcy Vargas, the First Lady of Brazil, arriving and being greeted by Yolanda Pinedo in this elegant outfit with the white hat. All the white rich ladies walk around and see the exhibition and model for us how we should be absorbing all the prizes of the biennial. And eventually, you see the men in the margins of the newsreel, including Matarazzo, the founding patron of the Biennale, and eventually we'll get to the Max Bill image, so y'all can keep watching. But okay, so another objective of my book is to argue for a more contested and less causal reading of the relationship between emergent abstract artists and new modern art museums, most notably the Biennale de São Paulo on one hand, and the institutional and exhibition history of the biennial itself. So I kind of pushed back against some of the interpretations that we've had of what the first and second biennial did. Still not there, sorry. I also assert that pedagogical institutions and a vibrant art press must also be counted prominently among that host of new post-war art institutions, and that they all, museums, exhibitions, art schools, periodicals, were entangled with a larger expanding consumer culture. Nope, sorry, I'm gonna keep moving, but it is exciting and it's available online, on YouTube, literally. Okay. Sorry, I feel like I'm doing propaganda for the videos now. So some images of the Biennale, the first poster, a view of the second Biennale, and then this phenomenal photograph that I came upon in MoMA's archives at the very end of my dissertation research, which I didn't include in my dissertation, but kept kind of troubling me. So one of the things that I propose in the book, building on other people's scholarship, is that the Biennale and these other art institutions were entangled in this larger expanding consumer culture, the confluence of art, shopping, tourism, and cultural diplomacy that Tony Bennett has termed the exhibitory complex. A photograph of a storefront display from 1955 showing mannequins and works of art displayed on easels captures the newfound embrace of abstract art in Brazil. What at first seems like a straightforward scene is, of course, layered with class, gendered, and racialized discourse that organize the reception of art and abstract art in Brazil. The connection between wealth, whiteness, and the conception of abstract art is made clear. Smartly dressed white mannequins, donning pearls and gloves, pose as both art admirers and as objects of admiration themselves. This photograph helped me formulate some of the questions I asked in the book via the lens of art and institutions around the changing conceptions of social identity in Brazil following the country's return to democracy in 1945. I argue that artists, as well as art patrons and critics, were highly visible subjects and agents of a reimagining of Brazilian citizenship in the context of the redemocratization following the Estado Novo dictatorship. These protagonists were, with few exceptions, privileged, educated, and white, self-taught artists, some Afro-descendant, most notably Hector dos Plazeres, were also elevated in the post-war cultural scene, but as a subsidiary to abstraction, papering over racial inequalities and promoting the myth of racial democracy. So Hector dos Plazeres won a prize at the first biennial and then meets with Vargas and the Minister of Culture. That's what the photograph up top shows. He was a civil servant actually working for the Ministry of Culture and got a promotion. So there's this way in which the art world is promoting an image of Brazil as a racial democracy that, of course, was and is not the reality. The celebration of abstract artists was filled with tensions and contradictions, of course, and as Mariola and I and many other scholars of our generation are arguing, these contradictions far eclipse the abstraction and figuration debates occurring in many places, including Brazil in the middle of the 20th century, in which the Communist Party promoted social realism and considered abstract art insufficient for political work and or polluted with entanglements of capitalism. So this, darn it, yet again, sorry. This contrast between like what happened after World War II, between the dominance of social realism and the dominance of abstraction after it, is honestly the question that I entered this with, but I've come to think that these works of art are more similar than style permits us to see that these are artists participating in a project of an image of Brazil as a modern state via the styles of their time. Anyway, we can talk more about that, but I've gone past my time, and pardon me for the tech issues.
So echoing Adele, thank you all so much for being here. And as Adele says, like, it's so great to sit in a room with supportive friends and community and those in the field that I admire so much and that I model, my practice after. So thank you as well to ISLAA, to Ariel, to Nicole, to Lucy, especially Nicole for all of your organizational work and many emails that I know it takes to organize an event like this. And thank you to Alex Albero. Alex and I go way back, and so it's wonderful to just sort of keep coming back in the circle. And so my mentorship, or Alex's mentorship of me, goes all the way back to undergrad, so a long time, as well as to the University of California Press. I'm so honored to be published by that press. And thank you so much to Roberto and your very kind words. I have to say, though, you saying no one touches neoconcretism, I'm like, oh, I'm such a fool. But I guess it's too late. It's out there. So as Adele said, it's great to follow because I'm going to reference especially museums or the biennial, and you have a little bit of a sense of that kind of cultural landscape. And so in my case, I focus very specifically then on the group of the Neoconcretists in Rio de Janeiro. Neoconcretism describes a highly charged, short-lived, and collaborative group in Rio de Janeiro of artist thinkers who made art and poetry together, regularly met at each other's homes to share their new projects and ideas, discussed and debated art and philosophy, exhibited their works together in galleries and museums, and revolutionized Brazilian art along the way. Their official existence as a group was only from 1959 to 1961, but their impact continues, and the book, again, is from 54 to 64, is looking at kind of those moments that precede the group that I think inform this thing called neoconcretism, and then even after, the way that that project continues in their works. The group coalesced around independent and multidisciplinary creativity, or as Ferreira Goulart named it, affinity. The title of this book, The Affinity of Neoconcretism, takes its cue from the concluding sentences of the Neoconcrete Manifesto from 1959, in which Goulart, a neoconcrete poet and art critic, wrote, quote, "The participants of the first neoconcrete exhibition do not comprise a group. They are not united by dogmatic principles. Their affinity is evident in the investigations each conducts in his or her own field, and that have brought them together here. The commitment that binds them does so first and foremost to their own experience, and they will stay together only as long as that deep affinity lasts," end quote. Neoconcretism was the result of the confluence of these varied investigations. The research questions that generated the book are: what does it mean to work as a group without subsuming the identity of each member to the larger whole? Or the difference between collaboration and a collective? How can that whole benefit from collaborative investigations into different media? And thus, how do artists learn from each other and from working collaboratively across media? And lastly, how can the study of the neoconcrete group provide a glimpse into the experience of post-war modernity? To answer these questions, I organized the chapters of the book as dialogues between multiple artists and poets and studied their production with an eye to what they shared with each other. In this way, I also counter the tendency in art history to privilege the work of an individual artist, or to rehearse previous scholarship that had considered in particular the work of two neoconcrete members, Ligia Clark and Elio Echizica. The book proposes a theory of neoconcretism as both written texts and visual art objects. The first section of the book, Reading Neoconcretism, attends to neoconcretism as textual discourse. Neoconcretism emerged from a debate about Brazilian poetry, and Chapter 1 argues for the significance of poetry to any understanding of the movement. Not only were 3 original members of the group poets, but also the central ideas of the movement were nurtured in the theorization of neoconcrete poetry and the notion of how ideas could be shared across page, canvas, and sculptural form. Chapter 2 studies the Rio de Janeiro newspaper Jornal do Brasil and its weekend supplement that served as both a place of work for many of the neoconcrete artists and also as the site of publicity for the group, its activities, and its writings. I argue that the newspaper cannot be relegated to the background of the background of the history of neoconcretism. And as an example, usually you would see the manifesto in exhibitions, but it's sort of like used for its content in that sense, rather than thinking about it as integral to how they were visualizing this thing called neoconcretism, and then importantly, publishing it in a mass media form, a newspaper that included politics and sports and feminine issues, which is one of their sections. Instead, the newspaper plays a central role in the formation and presentation of the group. The chapter presents the collaboration of the group as they translate neoconcrete aesthetics to print culture. Their work for the paper also locates them most clearly in a longer lineage of European and Latin American avant-garde movements. And so in the previous slide, I compare them to other journals that were often much smaller in their circulation. So for example, one for De Stijl, the Dutch and Western European movement, along with also Latin American journals as well that artists organized in Argentina, for example. So looking at how neoconcretism is kind of molding themselves within these larger patterns, both in Europe and across Latin America. The second section of the book, Embodying Neoconcretism, analyzes the neoconcretist propositions of embodiment through movement and performance. Chapter 3 addresses bodies in motion. In 1958, Lígia Papi and Reinaldo Jardim collaborated on the creation and choreography of a ballet based on one of Jargin's poems, which I show you his poem on the bottom, and then the ballet, which was these geometric forms that the dancers are inside of, and with wheels on the bottom that then they rolled around in the first ballet. And so, thinking about this is again published in the newspaper, so that juxtaposition of this ballet and the poem. They would go on to produce another ballet 2 years later, with Jardim composing the ballet's concrete music. The chapter examines the works in relationship to poetry, printmaking, especially with the help of Adele's article on Lígia Papi's prints, dance, and concrete music, and defines the ballets as the finest synthesis of the arts achieved during the neoconcrete period. Chapter 4 considers the work of several neoconcretists framed through the theorization of Siegfried Gideon's new monumentality, and the return to architecture as emotional forms and collaborative efforts. And I just wanted to include this photo because I love these moments where, again, you see them socializing with each other. So as, for example, family units with their children. And this is a collaboration that Weissman and Clark did of a Christmas tree for the museum in Rio. And so again, just showing that sense of how they were also socializing. Architecture offered a way to push the limits of viewer interactivity and inter-artistic collaboration, opening neoconcretism to a larger public audience and away from the private individual. Comparing the work of Franz Weissman and Lígia Clark opens neoconcretism to a new artistic exchange around issues of monumentality, industrial materials, and the gap between art and life. Lastly, I close with an analysis of Hélio Oiticica's Hunting Dogs project, which unfolds his work with that of Goulart and Jardim, demonstrating their common investigations into installation art, multisensorial environments, and the hybrid media of poetry, sculpture, theater, and architecture. Across these chapters, I highlight how the neoconcrete artists resisted a modernity too easily folded into the notion of modernization, or the rapid industrialization and mechanistic future pushed by the federal plans of the president of Brazil, Juscelino Kubitschek, who held office from 1956 to 1961. This 5-year period ushered in the return of participatory democracy that has been referenced already and a renewed nationalism. Kubitschek was the first elected president in more than 25 years to complete his term, and he would become the last for another 30 years given the military coup d'etat in 1964 that led to a military dictatorship. At the same time, the book shows how the artist took up materials, processes, systems, and references that related directly to this new administration. Thus, the complex knot of culture, politics, and economics as interrelated activities. These interim years of participatory democracy proved so fascinating for study because Kubitschek's government empowered a new emerging middle class, and neo-concrete culture formed part of this class. Whether the artists themselves or their central contributions to non-specialist culture like the newspaper read by most literate cariocas or the residents of Rio. Their interdisciplinary work allowed them to translate modernist abstract art, often assumed to be the terrain of only the rich elite, to fields of culture open to the larger public. Neoconcrete art did not necessarily attract enormous crowds, but I do not believe this detracts from them circulating as significant and central cultural objects and agents, as Adele said, in the history of Brazil. Neoconcrete culture offered the arts community and middle classes ways of viewing and experiencing art and culture as modern subjects. And so I think very much aligning or following from Adele is thinking about how art produces subjects. And so those subjects specifically then as white, middle class Brazilian subjects. Though the Neoconcretists aimed, I guess there isn't another one, aimed to empty their art of politics, and so I also take up this question of what we deem political art, because I think neoconcretism is political art. Most certainly as a response to the co-optation of the previous generation, so the example of Portinari that Adele showed, for example, which the neoconcretists had no time for, and so they really differentiated themselves from that sense of that co-optation that happened to Portinari. By the Brazilian government, it does not mean their project existed outside social conditions. The neoconcretists were both complicit and rebellious against the economic and social development occurring around them. They strongly rejected the notion of art as either a machine or a scientific specimen captured by the order of predetermined thought, while their work simultaneously depended on those forms. The theories of neoconcretism penned by Goulart often critique the dominant ideology of developmentalism espoused by the federal government and made visible a fear of the increasing commodification of the art object and culture more broadly. And yet, often their writings and intentions were in conflict with the actual art and poetry produced. Through an analysis of neoconcretism, including artworks, poems, theoretical writings, print media, and dance, I read for the ways in which the neoconcretists forced their practice into the center of the social and the political by way of their contradictory positionalities. In many ways, neoconcretism was a last gasp of modern art in Brazil, evident in the way they organized themselves, the forms they adopted to announce themselves, such as the manifesto, and the claim to break from previous movements and artists that depended on the notion of rupture to provide them with originality. And yet, the myth of modernism as a linear evolution or art history as a natural progression was troubled, and instead, Brazilian art demonstrated the revitalization of an unfinished project in its afterlife, thus out of time. Moreover, neoconcretism itself continues to influence and shape contemporary art. Goulart's theorization of the non-object, forged from the space between poetry, books, paintings, and sculpture, remains a potent idea for multimedia practitioners today, along with their integration of interactivity, participation, and environmental displays of art. Their artistic practices and neoconcretism, its art and theory, gave birth to one of the most creative and productive communities in Brazilian art history. And even though the group disbanded, their experiences within the movement continued to shape them in their many afterlives. Thank you.
Both books discuss crucial issues in art in general, but discussing them specifically, the idea of form in Adele's book, and the notion of time in Mariola's book. Would you like to expand on that a little?
Would you like to go first? Or do you want me to?
Yes, I'm trying to remember. I'm like writing. So yeah, it isn't something necessarily that is kind of a through line, in terms of articulated in the book, but it is there, latent in thinking about how they were conceiving of objects. And so, what I think of immediately is Goulard's sort of problem with a poem he's written that I publish in the book, where it has a word that's the same word repeated, and then a different word at the very end. And he's mad because someone tells him, he's like, did you read every word? And he's like, no, I just read the first one, and then I went to the last one. Like, it's all on the same page. And so that sense of, time is kind of like one moment, and that he wanted a sense of then the multiple moment, the kind of expanding of time or the unfolding of time. And so how part of what I really try to do in that first chapter is to think about how books as objects then allow for that sense of an unfolding of time, because you're moving pages, and then how that leads to something like the bichos of Clark that I didn't include it, but where you're again interacting and conceiving of the object as you move it into these different modes. And so, that sense of the unfolding and trying to have, a kind of almost slow experience, I think they are trying to achieve in all of their objects. So across, again, the different forms that I look at. So even with the newspaper, which you're having to translate a kind of avant-garde language to a mass media, print culture, it's still how are the words arranged in the page? How do you find words on a page? How does it grab your attention and move you here? And so it's always trying to think about choreographing that temporal experience. And that was also something I was interested in, that usually when we think of participation, it's about the kind of spectator who's controlling it, but I actually think the Neoconcretists were still really interested in how to choreograph for that kind of participant. They still were holding on to that sense of an authorship.
That's super interesting. And the current São Paulo biennial is called Choreographies of the Impossible. So I've been trying to, as a non-dance person, think about choreography lately. So that I learned from that. Thank you. So one of the, we as a generation of US-based scholars inherited quite a remarkable narrative of this post-war moment in Brazil, right? Reinaldo Brito's narrative, Aracy Amaral's questioning of art for what, and the rupture she sees. And so the thing that I got excited about was trying to pay attention to the terminology that the artists were using at the time. So for me, the term that started when I was revising the dissertation for the book and doing these new object art group, artist-focused chapters, Geraldo de Barros, Valdemar Cordeiro, but also Mario Pedrosa in his writing were talking extensively about forma in the late 40s, about abstraction, but also about other things. Pedrosa was talking about not just abstract art using this term, and they were thinking about Gestalt psychology, which there's been beautiful scholarship about that by many people. But what I found kind of compelling about this theory of form was that both of them were thinking about things that both were forms and weren't forms, and then it becomes a title of works of art, forma objecto, and it helped me actually understand what they meant by concretism, that these were objects that had embodied form. And another kind of terminology thing that always tripped me up is that we call it concrete art in the US, but in Brazil, the artists were referring to it as concretismo. And so what was that inversion that was happening with the ismo and trying to, decenter a story of any kind of Latin American history that continues to center Europe and the US, so dethroning Max Bill, though of course he was in the mix. And I feel like forma was a way that these artists and thinkers, in dialogue with looking at the art of psychiatric patients, in the case of Pedrosa and Geraldo de Barros. Children's art, in the case of Ivan Sepa, was an early theory of concretism. And so anyway, that was like a moment of trying to pay attention to the terminology they were using. And yeah, that's why form became important for me.
Changing the subject from one pole to the other, instead of art, I would focus on context. Both books bring, with the wonderful research you do, Adele discusses social identities beyond, relating but beyond the myth of the three races that built Brazil, but also in connection with gender and class. While Mariola deals with how neoconcrete artists wanted to produce universal art, but at the end were middle-class individuals. Would you like to talk about that?
Do you want me to go first this time? Okay, well, let's see if this will work. Nope, oh, darn it. Sorry, very big apologies, Nicole. This doesn't look as pretty, but, okay, so I cruised past this image, but oh, thank you. What engaged me, I love photographs, these incredible photos of society, like debutantes, rich society girls, young ladies, in an installation of the Grupo Ruptura show in 1952 at the Museum of Modern Art, where the newspaper, in the feminine section of the newspaper, reproduces the manifesto, but also a conversation between these young women saying, like, we don't understand a word they're saying, this is hilarious, this is a charade. And the captions give the details of their outfits and the designers, but not the works of art. And trying to think about what abstract art was doing in the early 50s, right? Some people were just saying it's nonsense, but what was it doing for an emergent middle class post a dictatorship? Brazil is experiencing incredible economic prosperity. And so I think that the consumers of art, you saw this in the part of the newsreel that I didn't plan to show, but of all the ladies in their smart suits going through the biennial and showing us how we're supposed to studiously look at these things. And the newsreel's amazing because Darcy Vargas looks so bored, like she's not following the rules of that she's supposed to be enlightened by all this art that's won awards at the first biennial. At the same time, the largely white male artists who composed both Grupo Ruptura and Grupo Franchi in Rio, many of them are recent immigrants or the children of immigrants, a lot of them in the São Paulo case of Italian descent. And those emergent middle class, working class Italian Brazilians were not considered white Brazilians. In a US context, they would be called ethnic whites. And I think part of what started to interest me is the ways in which Cordeiro there in his suit, who is positioning himself as a public intellectual, as a public thinker, and that abstract art was part of how, and modern art, broadly speaking, was part of how these artists asserted themselves as artists, as white individuals in Brazilian society. And then somebody like Ligia Clark, I think, was incredibly smartly navigating this expectation that women were the consumers of art and men were the producers of art. And in this photo array that she had shot in 1952 or 3, a headshot from this group of photographs gets reproduced in a Grupo Frente catalog, but I don't know yet, and I don't think it's been figured out if these were ever published, but they're in her papers, of her in this beautiful outfit. Ligia Clark was from a wealthy family, was married to an engineer, an outfit coordinated with their paintings on a fur, an animal skin rug. So I think she's very smartly walking this line between the consumer, who's the delicious thing to be absorbed along with the art, and the maker of it. And she savvily remakes her image as an artist. By the end of the 1950s, she's what I do not write in the book, but think of as sort of Hampton chic. She's wearing a white shirt and worker pants, and she's spray painting her modulated surfaces, and she starts talking about shooting her paintings, like using a pistola, the spray gun. So I think she's very savvily like navigating, how do I get purchase on being an artist when the expectation of me is to be the consumer of these products. So yeah, that's some of what I was thinking about around social identities. I'm gonna go off this image.
Oh, no, you can keep it. I'll also come back. Actually, I was going to talk about that same photo. I mean, I think I'm fascinated, beyond this book, and I feel like in many of my classes, is also just this historical moment of why abstraction is a global phenomena. Like, why is it something, that almost becomes this universal currency? We can all speak abstract and understand each other. And so I think Brazil, and the artists in that moment understand, that kind of purchase that it has to be able to communicate then beyond their own borders, but also not necessarily in the sense of only, exporting, but it's like a dialogue. Like we can all be talking to each other and sort of have, in that sense, this horizontality of like power hierarchies, which of course we all know to be false, but that I think was the kind of optimistic or sort of faith in the project of abstraction, and again, beyond Brazil. But I think, what's important is, as I say, that there's like this kind of unmarked quality. We are universal, and I feel like that's something also, for example, one of my reviewers said of just the problematics of, keep saying Brazilian art, for example, or that they're representative of this place called Brazil, that is a really large country with many different populations, and, the two cities that are the kind of cosmopolitan, right, and richest cities then get to represent, and the kind of problematics of just their assumption of that, and with me as the author looking at this period, and so how to make kind of more visible how, again, as I mentioned before, they're using art to form, right, to shape these middle-class subjects that then, could partake of that culture. And, you have, in the book, I talk about the difference between elite and, again, this sense of cultured, that you don't have to be rich to be cultured. And so one of those ways to be cultured is through the art you might be going to see or a book you might buy. And that starts to like flatten these different class, kind of structures. But nevertheless, it's still producing, right, this thing called the middle class, and what are the kind of values of a middle class, and what are, again, the politics of a middle class that, what does it then occlude and erase as a result. And so I also, throughout the book, talk about neoconcretism as this kind of didactic project in that sense. And, even when you talk about SITBA, like just the way pedagogy is involved and how the newspaper is a form of pedagogy, right? Like Goulart is going to tell you a history of art by just reading the newspaper. And so, how are all of those kind of technologies in a sense of producing class and as a result, erasing, right, other kind of populations and classes. But I think it's important as well, and I talk about in the comparison with Weissman and Clark is exactly, the image that Adele was talking about of Clark as kind of worker, and Weissman, worked in his brother's bus, depot, and he's making his monumental forms, right, that require the sense of construction like a laborer. So when are they, again, borrowing that kind of rhetoric or visual presentation? And so obviously in the example of the Weissman, a lot of his works are not titled by him. They're given titles, and they're often these titles of construction, like bridge, column. And so obviously that relates to just thinking about the discourse of architecture, but it's also about, like, we are workers building this country, but we're building this country for, again, a white middle class kind of project. And so just trying to really articulate that through these different kind of registers, again, of within poetry, newspapers, sculpture, like how is it happening across their forms?
I prepared many questions, and while they were presenting and answering, I had new ideas, but I don't want to monopolize the discussion. I think it's time to open for the audience, and who wants to continue?
I have a question for Adele Nelson. You end with this really intriguing remark on the parallelism between the social realism or socialist realism on the one side and the abstraction on the other, being both promoters of modernity. And I mean, I was thinking about that and like wondering, okay, so how would a dress look like of coffee? Because that was one of the photos you showed, right? Was it a Jackson Pollock as a dress, or?
No, but it recalls that image, yeah.
Right.
No, it's just like her rad skirt that coordinates with
On
her.
the left, right? The one looks
her
like
dress.
almost like a Pollock as a dress. And you.
Oh. You know what? I've looked at that photograph a lot, and I've never noticed that before. So thank you for pointing that out to me.
So I guess my question is, whose modernity are they promoting? Because it does seem like, what is the similarity here?
Yeah. It was, I said it in a rush, feeling like I was coming up against time. But I mean, I think that, I had the privilege in my graduate studies of being mentored by scholars who focused on the 20s and 30s, who were always asking me to be critical of these triumphalist stories about abstraction after World War II, which are not Latin American stories, those are global stories, as Mariola was saying, right? We have those stories, Pollock's story in the US. And like Arasi Amaral, who's a scholar that has been very formative for me, like, she asked these questions, like, what was art for? And one of the sort of ruptures that's often cited, not just in Brazilian art history, but globally, is between this dominance of social realism in the 30s and 40s to a dominance of abstraction, gestural here, and in some places in Europe, and geometric in some places in Latin America, as well as gestural. But I just, and this is maybe too glib, but I don't say this in the book, it's just something I'm thinking about now, meaning not right now, but broadly now, so there's a new issue of Latin American and Caribbean ethnic studies organized by 3 scholars on whiteness in Latin America, Hugo Serran Ananya, Patricia Santa Ana Pino, and Ana Ramos Zayas. And they write in their introduction how whiteness functions in Latin American discourses of mestizaje and mestizaging more through the production of otherness and racelessness than by making itself visible or explicit. And I think that that's fascinating. I think that in this post-war moment, the whiteness is quite visible. Like it was pretty clear the story of Brazil that was being told. It was a story of a ultra-modern, horizontal peer to international, rapidly industrializing country centered in the city of São Paulo was the story that the São Paulo biennial was certainly telling. But I wonder if part of the invisibility of whiteness, not just in Latin America, although these scholars are trying to think about the study of whiteness in Latin America as in dialogue with, but separate from critical whiteness studies in the United States. But I wonder whether and again, just thinking this through now, like some of the invisibility of whiteness keeps us from seeing that these are similar things, even though they're stylistically very different, right? This is a prize-winning work that went to the Carnegie International. Portinari's works are made up of Afro-descendant individuals often, and an identity that he did not occupy himself, but received both international praise for, a show at MoMA, patronage of Vargas, who wasn't supporting any other living artist, right? Who wanted murals on the public buildings in Rio, these new ministries that he had organized full of Afro-descendant individuals laboring in this new Brazil, right? So that's just, sorry, I gave it as a one-off and now I'm giving it to you as a one-off again, but that's what I was thinking about.
So I have a question. I'm not too familiar with Neoconcretism as a movement. I see that there's a lot of, you've spoken both beautifully about visual arts, and there was a touching upon the influence of performing arts in the movement as well. I'm particularly interested in the dance part of it. What was the extent of involvement that, say, the visual arts the visual artists that were part of the movement had with dance styles that were prevalent at the time, whether it's ballet or any of the indigenous styles of Brazil. What was the influence of the performing arts on the movement itself at that time?
I mean, in the image I showed, so that first ballet, it is organized as part of an evening of performances. So I talk about how the kind of what the shock must have been to see then, geometric shapes moving around without any actual bodies, whereas all the other performances were classical ballet performances. And the person who, led or kind of organized it, and he's included as well, in the kind of newspaper images with the Neoconcrete ballet. And I should say this is, back to like the kind of periodization, is that this ballet already happened before Neoconcretism comes into being with the manifesto, and it's called Concrete Ballet. And then they redo it when they have their first exhibition, and they call it Neoconcrete Ballet. So that's where I meant like this idea of how, what was already happening pre-1959 kind of informs this thing called neoconcretism. So it's sort of false to give it, this kind of very limited time frame. And so, when it happened pre-1959, it was part of this evening that included classical ballet, and, that main dancer who was Brazilian, trained, especially with, again, the story of Brazil at this time is so many immigrants coming, and so with immigrants from Europe, and then he also travels to the US and becomes involved with more kind of the, beginnings of what would become postmodern, dance in the US. And so, that's a whole other, again, I wish somebody more would write, about him and his, because I think he also is a kind of collaborator as well in this ballet. But the kind of shock then of you've watched these classical ballets and then all of a sudden these geometric forms are just moving around. And I talk about the fact, that there are no bodies, and how much dance, especially in a classical sense, relies on a body that you're seeing, and the kind of the heroics, right, of that body, and the way the costumes allow it to be seen. And so instead for them, how they're thinking about geometry as expression. So that's, again, a through line across all of these works, is how can we have geometry become something that's expressive, which is kind of a paradox, you would think, but they are really trying to push. And so dance, for me, is the way they succeed, right, as I say, in the kind of finest synthesis of really having, these forms that then are moving around, and you don't see bodies, but then you're, again, that same kind of emotive quality that you would have watching dance you have now for geometry. And so in the second one, I should say, it's just these orthogonal forms, so a square and slightly larger than a square. The dancers behind it, there's only two of them, and they, again, like the squares move around, and you never see the body behind it. And so, but I also talk about in that particular chapter of just thinking about, they were very, as I said, allergic to the kind of relationship of art to sort of the mechanical and the technological. And so I pose the question, aren't these dancers kind of robotic? Because there are no bodies that you're seeing. And Reinaldo Jorginho has a quote that I use that, thinks about the cyborg. And so just the way that you start to have these, kind of pouring in of these, or I should say more like trickling in of these languages. And so that's a moment where, as I noted in my intro, like they're allergic, but they're also using the terms. So that kind of contradiction within the work. So again, how is geometry both expressive and robotic simultaneously? It's not, right, they aren't necessarily a binary.
It sounds like this is kind of in opposition to what was going on, say, in New York.
Yeah.
In the 50s with postmodern
Right.
dance coming through Judson and all that,
Yeah.
where even though the body's like center, it's actually trying to go towards like the everyday movement
Yeah.
versus stylized movement, but they're doing it with form and shape rather than the physical body.
Yeah.
Interesting.
We can also ask questions with drink and food.
Do you want to wrap up everything?
You're in charge. Sorry, I should
No. We are supposed to go until 8.
Oh,
Isn't it,
pardon me.
Nicole?
It's 5 minutes.
We have time for one more question.
There you go.
Anyone has one more question?
So I have a question, actually. highly contextual, but I'm sort of really interested in these institutional apparatuses that comprise this constellation of agents that contribute to the production of the white middle class as the new image of the nation state. So who's behind the press, and how does it happen that the press sort of gets on board, so to speak, with that project?
Yeah, I mean, lots of people are behind the newspapers I investigate. Mariola might be able to speak about the Jornal do Brasil, which itself has a pretty complex history, in my sense. But, I mean, one of the places that I got very interested in my final chapter is a newspaper that has, and, you know, I think this is evident, but it warrants saying, like, we're building our understandings of these things about the middle class around the scholarship of enormous numbers of other people, historians among them. So there's a historian who's written really smartly about this one politician in Brazil in a newspaper he founded that Lygia Clark is kind of like a semi-celebrity in the mid-50s. And like including we learn who she voted for in the recent election, and there's an article about like women who wear pants and professional women in Copacabana. And this historian and other scholars have talked about how this newspaper attempted to cultivate white middle-class women in an anti-Vargas campaign. And a media that I do not spend time on but should is the radio, which was also a very dominant media at the time. But that's one source. There's also like the patron behind MASP, Assis Chateaubriand, was a media mogul. So he had newspapers. He's the first person who brought TV to Brazil. He had radio programs, and the Museum of Modern Art in Rio, the president, the leading, not the initial president, but the president who had the most mark on the early history of the Museum of Modern Art. Her husband owned a newspaper. Those newspapers trumpeted the museums. They often did the dirty work. In São Paulo, there were rival institutions, so the newspapers would go after the other institutions. So there were some of them were industrialists, some of them were media magnates, some of them were politicians themselves with their own partisan aims in their coverage. Newspapers were supporting exhibitions, so they were very much in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, and I just want to underscore that point of that you just see then this contamination in that sense between the museums and the exhibition, right, of having this such prominence for exhibition reviews and art criticism, because that only benefits then the owners of the newspaper, who also then are, right, the owners or kind of founders of these museums and institutions. And so in the case of Jornal do Brasil, I should say Adele, thank you for reminding me, like Reinaldo Jardim was a radio host for the Jornal do Brasil radio, and then he's the one that really suggests, or, you know, again, that's how the history is written, to redevelop this cultural supplement, and he then becomes the editor, and, you know, revolutionizes the design and the kind, who's writing for it, the sort of, again, intellectual level. It's publishing and translating, you know, foreign texts into Portuguese, and so that sense again of, you know, these texts are important for us to be reading in Brazil, so we need to be translating them. But the owner of the newspaper is a countess, so that's also important, is to remember that aristocracy still is something that, you know, came through Portugal to Brazil and continued. And so, you know, she is a very elite, literally, right, in the sense I was trying to distinguish of, you know, a kind of cultured middle class, but she's, I mean, elite and aristocratic, and is funding in that sense this project, but, you know, is not involved. And there was many debates, you know, about the cultural supplement, and including just the way it was redesigned and the kind of cost of that. And so, you know, it wasn't necessarily tensionless, and again, short-lived, but that was the kind of backstory. And so since Jardim and Goulart were involved, Amilcar da Castro, like they all, again, contributed and kind of, again, were translating their own artistic ideas within a newspaper form.
I think we have to finish, unfortunately. But we can continue as Adele suggested. Drinking. Do you want to make a question? No. Okay.